and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's good to have you with us. This week we're looking at a post-resurrection appearance in John's Gospel that transformed the fortunes of Peter, who had previously denied 3 times that he knew Jesus. Before we dive into this, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it helpful to download the sheet that accompanies this study. You'll find the link for that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado then, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from John's Gospel, chapter 21, verses 1 to 19. This passage follows on from 2 other post-resurrection appearances in chapter 20 verses 19 to 23 and then verses 24 to 31. Both had occurred in a locked upper room in Jerusalem where the 11 and the other disciples who were with them were hiding out for fear of the Jewish authorities. Jesus had appeared in that locked room and Thomas had confessed, "My Lord and my God," made that profound statement of faith in chapter 20, verse 28. The action here in chapter 21 shifts away from Jerusalem and back to Galilee, in particular to the shore of the Sea of Tiberias, sometimes called the Sea of Galilee, as we saw in chapter 6, verse 1, for example. And we don't get a sense of how long the gap was between those events in Jerusalem and what we now have back in Galilee. So there's a degree of ambiguity there about the setting. In this passage, we have Jesus, obviously, and we're shown through his eating of fish and bread in verses 9 to 13 that the resurrection body was a physical body, albeit from the earlier accounts we've just talked about, not the same sort of physicality as you and I in the here and now. We've also got Simon Peter, who we know from chapter 1 verses 40 to 42 was among the first disciples to be called to follow Jesus. And he had denied, as we see in chapter 18 verses 15 to 18 and 25 to 27, that he knew Jesus. He did that 3 times. And as much as anything else, this passage is about Simon Peter's restoration. We also have the beloved disciple, described, as we see at the beginning of verse 7 in today's reading, as the disciple Jesus loved. And this was probably John, for whom the Gospel of John and the Johannine community was named. And also in this reading, though they don't have a speaking part as such, we've got Thomas, Nathaniel, and James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And they're the remaining disciples that are there, along with 2 unnamed others. So it's possible one of those unnamed others is the beloved disciple. Now, John's Gospel was the last to be written around 90 to 95 of the Common Era. And what marks it out from the Synoptic Gospels, i.e. Mark, Matthew and Luke, is that it contains a depth of theological reflection that we perhaps don't find in those earlier works, and a slightly different kind of presentation of Jesus. This resurrection appearance quite possibly constitutes a later addition to John's Gospel, an additional ending, taking us beyond what we found in chapter 20, verses 30 to 31, which does itself form, I think, the original ending of the Gospel. And there's a profound connection with what we find in Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11, that describes the calling of Peter to be a disciple in the first place, and again a miraculous catch of fish that was made possible when the disciples listened to Jesus and dropped their nets where he told them to. I wonder, therefore, if the Luke passage was actually influenced in some way by a post-resurrection appearance that found its way eventually to John's Gospel through this additional ending. Or perhaps this is a description of a post-resurrection appearance influenced more by Luke's Gospel. We don't know, but it is worth recognising the connections between the two of them. In John's Gospel, the reception of the Holy Spirit occurs when the risen Jesus is still with the disciples, in chapter 20, verses 22 to 23. But Peter's reaction, having been present for this reception of the Holy Spirit and both of these other resurrection appearances, was, as we learn in verse 3 of today's passage, to convince his friends to go fishing. It shows perhaps, as one commentator put it, that Peter still needed some guidance as his particular role in the community as the rock upon which Christ would build the church kind of became more fully fleshed out. But perhaps simply, Peter needed to return to something that was familiar and safe after such a challenging and difficult time. Perhaps he was still feeling profoundly guilty about his threefold denial of Jesus and not yet ready to fully commit himself. Who knows? What we can say is that Jesus transforms Peter's attempt to return to his previous occupation as a fisherman after a night in which, verse 3 tells us, the disciples had caught nothing while they were drawing on their own strength and own efforts alone. This final breakfast, as it were, that we see laid out in verses 3 to 13 of today's reading, transforms the deprivation at the start of the passage, in more senses than one, into abundance and joy. At daybreak, and after this fruitless night of effort, Jesus stood on the beach. But as with Mary Magdalene in chapter 20, verses 11 to 18, his friends didn't initially recognise him, as we hear about in verse 4. Yet when Jesus refers to the disciples as children at the beginning of verse 5, it points to his intimate knowledge of them, even as they don't recognise him. It's perhaps the mirror of the way Jesus calls Mary by name in the garden, and that's the point where she recognises him. When the disciples answered no to Jesus' question about whether they caught any fish at the end of verse 5, he told them in verse 6 that they'd have some success if they put down their nets again on the right side of the boat. And as in the narrative in Luke's Gospel, perhaps they were tired, maybe reluctant, but they give it a go anyway, and they end up with a bumper catch of fish. That prompts the beloved disciple in verse 7 to recognise Jesus. And Peter responds to this recognition that's been laid before him by putting on some clothes and swimming out to meet Jesus. He can't wait, it seems, to get to Jesus, which is an interesting one, so given the difficult things that had passed between the two of them. Perhaps Peter again needed to see for himself. Who knows? But what we do know is that, as verse 8 tells us, the other disciples were left dragging this heavily laden boat with its nets bursting with fish to the shore. Jesus invited his friends to share in a breakfast of cooked fish and bread that had been cooking on a charcoal fire. And that probably would have triggered memories for Peter of that evening of Maundy Thursday, taking us to chapter 18, verse 18, when he'd warmed himself by a charcoal fire as Jesus was interrogated by the chief priests and the scribes. Verse 10 shows us that Peter was sent to bring some of the miraculous catch of fish to Jesus, and he helped his friends drag in the net, as we see in verse 11, which did not break despite the mass of fish. Though it's worth noting, as we can see from verse 13, that actually none of this huge catch was actually eaten. It's one of those intriguing details of the text. The experience of abundance here is captured by the 153 fish that are talked about, huge fish. Now, commentators have argued down the centuries as to the significance of the number 153, and that's partly because John's Gospel is a really symbolic Gospel, and I think part of the product of the fact that it's the last Gospel and has this greater level of theological reflection is there's often a lot of double meanings just under the surface. And indeed, if you Google it, there are arguments out there that seem to explain away the 153 in lots of complex ways. But I wonder if it's as simple as either there were 153 members of John's community when this was written, and it was trying to say that all of them belonged to God, or it really was just a number of fish that were actually caught in this episode. Either way, the abundance takes us back to the production of 120 to 180 gallons of wine in the wedding at Cana in chapter 2 verses 1 to 11, and the 12 baskets of leftovers from the feeding of the 5,000 narrated in chapter 6 verses 1 to 14. And as I say, there is no scholarly consensus on the significance, if any, of the number 153. So we just take it as it was about the abundance of God's kingdom, God's new creation breaking through in that moment, if we're going to ascribe significance to the number at all. The meal that we see described in verses 12 to 13, if you think about it, has a very Eucharistic kind of quality to it. It may remind us of Holy Communion with Jesus blessing and sharing food among his disciples. And we're told, interestingly, that they were too scared to ask who Jesus was because they already knew. Perhaps there was a sense in which they were too frightened to state the obvious. I don't know. It's one of those intriguing details where you kind of think, what was that actually about? Things move on quite quickly, though, to a private encounter between Simon Peter and Jesus, which perhaps brings all of these tensions bubbling under the surface to a head. And his threefold conversation mirrors that threefold denial of Maundy Thursday, and I think brings about healing and restoration for Peter. Now, it's notable that throughout this interaction, when Jesus asks Peter if he loves him, he uses his original name. He calls him Simon, son of John, rather than Peter, which was the name that Jesus gave to him. And I think, therefore, this is, as much as anything else, a recommissioning of Peter as a disciple. Now, in verses 15 and 16, Jesus uses the Greek word agape for love, whereas Peter replies with another Greek word for love, philos, which was associated with friendship kind of love. And both use this word philos in verse 17. Now, this is important because sometimes when people have talked about different Greek words that are present for love, eros, philos, and agape, it's been done in a very hierarchical kind of a way, as if to say, well, eros, erotic love, we don't need to bother with that. Philos, friendship love, fine, but agape is the gold standard, as it were. This interaction between Jesus and Simon Peter blows that understanding out of the water. And it shows that agape and philos were used interchangeably. We find other instances of that in chapter 3, verse 35 and chapter 5, verse 20, when the Father's love for the Son is stated, firstly in agape and then as philos, respectively. And when Jesus clarifies the meaning and scope of the term agape, he does it in relation to the word philos, as we see in chapter 15, verses 13 and 15. In this passage, Peter in this restoration is called to a new type of leadership, as we see in verses 15 to 17. He's no longer to be a fisherman, but a shepherd, and he's called to feed the sheep of God's pasture, which might take us back to Jesus' declaration that he is the good shepherd from chapter 10, verses 1 to 5. But as we hear about in verse 18, taking on this role, stepping into Jesus' footsteps, shepherding God's people, will come at a cost. And by the time John's Gospel was written, we will know Peter's execution. Tradition has it that he was crucified upside down. So he was led where he wouldn't necessarily have wished to have gone. But when we get to verse 19 and Peter is once again invited to follow Jesus, the expectation is very much that he's going to put an active love, an agape love, bound up with philos, friendship love, into practice. So there's a lot going on in this later additional ending to John's Gospel. And it's a fascinating text to spend some time with, particularly thinking about the role of Simon Peter. And not in today's lectionary reading is a little bit of a conversation between Jesus and Simon Peter about the place of the beloved disciple, where Peter's effectively told to mind his own business and get on with his ministry. So there's yet more to be said about this fascinating text. And with that in mind, we now turn to our questions.